Hey everyone, it's Mr. Stafford, and today we're going to be talking about American farmers, the powerful monopolists who made their lives miserable, and if there's time, we'll talk about the Wizard of Oz. Yep, that's right, the Wizard of Oz. Alright, so let's get started. The late 19th century. This is a time, remember, that we've already talked a lot about, and it's a time of rapid change in the American economy, which is in turn going to lead to rapid change in American politics and American society. We've already talked a little bit about how this change has led to conflict. We learned about the conflict between the settlers and the Native Americans, factory owners and their workers, and this week we're going to look at two more areas of conflict. The conflict between the farmers and the railroads, and the increasing racial conflict in the South. This video is going to address the farmers movement and the rise of the populists, and I'll save racial conflict for my next video. So let's jump right in. By the 1890s, there's millions of American farmers who have joined what was known as the Populist Movement. But before we talk about the Populist Movement, a little context is in order. The late 19th century was a time of rapid growth and expansion, and as the West is settling, farming is going to become a major enterprise in the region. So farmers are producing not just for themselves, but for the market, and so the large bonanza farms that we talked about last time were dependent on access to distant markets, which in turn meant that these farmers were dependent on the railroads, who were the only ones who could provide the access they needed to these distant markets. The Civil War had interrupted production in the United States, and the result was that other countries are going to start producing some of the same crops that previously they had been purchasing from the United States of America. Cotton is a great example of this. During the war, a shortage caused increased production in new regions. When the South got up and running again, what they found was that the increased global supply of cotton dramatically depressed the prices and caused them to go into debt that they would never recover from. Likewise, with the expansion of agriculture into the West, increased supply once again is going to drive down prices. In addition, farmers are relying on banks for loans and railroads to get their produce to the market. So there were a lot of factors that contributed to the plight of the farmers, but increasingly the farmers are going to focus their anger and frustration on three targets: the banks, the railroads, and the government monetary policies, so the federal government's policy. Target number one is the banks. The banks are charging high interest rates for the farmers for the loans that they need to buy the seed and the fertilizer. Remember, farmers get paid when they sell their crops, and they usually need to borrow money to make it through to the harvest season. Two, the railroads. The major railroad companies had monopolies on shipping. They used that advantage to charge the farmers what the farmers considered to be unreasonably high prices. Finally, the federal government. The farmers argued that the monetary policies of the federal government, keeping money supply low by sticking to the gold standard, those policies they thought were intended to favor the wealthy creditors and industrialists and not the debtors like them. From the farmers' perspective, the monopolistic banks and railroads were using their advantage to exploit the farmers, and the federal government was helping them do it. So charging high interest and shipping rates because the farmers had no alternative. The farmers had no choice but to use the railroad that went through their town. Again, major problem with monopolies. So what do the farmers do? Well, they did just what their industrial counterparts did. They began to organize. This organization starts with the Farmers Alliance, founded in the late 1870s. And this is an attempt to organize farmers so they could cooperatively fight back against the banks and the big railroads. By 1890, the Farmers Alliance was active in 43 states. Farmers were working together to come up with solutions to their problems. One of their main proposals was what they called the Sub-Treasury Plan. The Alliance proposed that the federal government establish warehouses where farmers could store their crops until the crops were sold. Using the crops as collateral, the government could then provide the farmers with low-interest loans, which would end the farmers' dependence on the big banks. This movement into politics led to the rise of what would become known as the Populist Party. The Populist Party adopted a platform with a long list of proposals that they thought would restore democracy and economic opportunity. Many of these proposals were considered radical, and though many failed at the time, many would be adopted over the next few decades. Let's look at a couple examples. One, to fight political corruption, populists proposed the direct election of senators. It's not going to happen at the time, but it will happen a few decades later with the passage of the 17th Amendment. They argued also that the wealthy should pay their fair share, and proposed a graduated income tax where the more money you make, the more you pay in taxes. Now, there was no income tax even at the time the populists were proposing this, but this too would become a reality a few decades later with the passage of the 16th Amendment. Populists also called for things like public ownership of the railroads to guarantee affordable access to markets. They called for a system of low-cost financing or subsidized farm loans to increase the profitability of their farming. And they wanted the government, the American government, to control American currency. As the Populist Party grew, it sought new allies, and it struggled to build a diverse coalition of white and black, farmer and factory worker, northerner and southerner. The Democratic Party, feeling threatened by the Populists, used fear to weaken the Populist coalition. And by the time of the election of 1896, they ultimately consumed the bulk of the Populist coalition. The Democrats adopted parts of the Populist platform, and their presidential candidate, William Jennings Bryan, famously decried the gold standard with his famous Cross of Gold speech, demanding that the government support the inflationary policies that the farmers demanded. The election of 1896 is often called the first modern presidential campaign because of the massive amounts of money that poured in to support the Republican candidate, William McKinley. Bryan's speech about corporate greed and the need for inflationary monetary policies scared the industrialists, and they poured millions of dollars into the Republican candidate, William McKinley. While the Republicans raised nearly $10 million, William Jennings Bryan and the Democrats raised about $300,000. From here on out, big money would play a big role in national politics. Ultimately, the Republicans would prevail in 1896, and the Populist Party would eventually fizzle out. But not after establishing an agenda that the progressives are going to pick up in the early 20th century. So, although the Populist Party was ultimately unsuccessful at accomplishing their progressive agenda, they staked a place for the farmer in national politics, and they laid the groundwork for a progressive movement that would continue into and throughout the 20th century. That's about it. So be sure to keep reading the chapter on your own. In my next video, we'll talk about the rise of Jim Crow and the segregated South. And it looks like we didn't have time to make it to the Wizard of Oz. But if you want to see what the Wizard of Oz has to do with all of this, check out the video, Does the Wizard of Oz Have Hidden Meaning? I'll put the link in the description below, or I'll probably just add that video to this playlist as well. Alright guys, thanks for watching. Again, be sure to read the chapter, and I'll see you in class.